Welcome to Cross Platform Podcast, where we discuss how to solve productivity problems across platforms. I'm Augusto Pinot,
I'm Mark Elwitz.
and today we're discussing about ecosystems. And this, I think, art has bring us once again to complete another circle. Many years back, when Art and I met and began recording Productivity Cast, I remember, pointing out the difference in technology and between the iOS and the Android. And at some point, we came to the first circle when the technology really began to match and was now a matter of choice and a matter of what you prefer to have more than the capabilities that one platform have. And now we are coming to the point that these platforms are part of an ecosystem, are part of something bigger. And iOS integrates very well with the Mac. Samsung integrate very well with Windows, and they are working into create a similar thing to what the Mac have. And I've been saying on the Samsung events that they seem to be follow more and more from the Apple playbook. Um, that may not happen if you just get Lenovo Duet, for example. The Lenovo Duet, as far as I know, they don't integrate as well with Windows. They are starting to work into that, but it's not as solid as the work that Samsung has done to integrate their own machines into an ecosystem. And that's a discussion today as you are looking into these devices, and assuming you have the option, is worth to live in an ecosystem or not. It doesn't matter what you get. And I was sharing a story in the pre-show with Art of a friend of mine who called me, I don't know, some weeks back, say, okay, finally, I'm going to buy me an iPad. I want to move my notebook. I'm done with the paper. I'm traveling too much. I want something that I can take digital notes. I already happened a couple of times that because this person travels so much and takes so many notes that the notebook, the note that she need was on a notebook on her office, and where she was traveling, there was no way to get that information, and she was frustrated. So I say, "Fine, tell me which is the iPad I need to buy, and I will take it." And I said, "Stop! You have a Samsung phone." Say, "Yes, I do." And I say, "Then you don't want to have an iPad. You want to buy a Samsung." And Art helped me on the pick of the device. I don't have enough knowledge to recommend that, but I call Art and say, "Hey, what is it, the device?" And he gave me a couple of options, and based on the screen size, this person picked the device of choice. But could this person will have done it on an iPad for what she wanted? Yes, but having already a Samsung smartphone where this person is happy and very comfortable will have been a disservice to recommend an iPad when I know that this is not a capability issue. It is really, she's going to get much more gain from living in this ecosystem. The only difference is the application that I would recommend is not yet on the Android world, that is Good Notes, but it's coming there for Samsung devices. There is a beta version, and Art has recommended a couple of applications that she can use for her feed. But when this person was asking me, she was looking at me and say, "I don't understand. You use iPad. Why you're recommending me this?" I say, if your phone will have been just an Android, okay, probably will have not matter. But having the advantage of the ecosystem, the advantage that you are going to grab that thing, that you're going to grab your PC and you're going to grab your phone, and everything will connect and be like you have a device, even if you have three or four. It is a significant game changer, and it gives you an incredible advantage. I always said I can grab any of my devices and I can continue exactly where I was. And there is a massive power into that. If I am working in the Mac, that happened rarely, okay, and I'm going to leave my office, Okay. I can grab my iPad with data and I will be connected and invisible transition no matter where I go. So that ecosystem had, in my perspective, an incredible amount of power. And that's where I want to start the show today, telling that story. And you also have an ecosystem, but you have art parts of your system that do not belong necessarily to that ecosystem. Not every device that you have, it is a Samsung device. So you have more of a mixture, if I am correct on
I,
what I'm going to say.
I used to have more of a okay. I have a lot of mixture, but if you look at the primary set of devices I use, they are all within that core ecosystem. And that I want to explore that term a little bit because when you look at Apple, Apple is by its design an ecosystem.
Mhm.
Apple
Correct.
products interact with other Apple products. The Apple operating system is designed to interact, unless it's Mac OS versus iOS, that's a whole different thing. Uh, but
But
that
even on
package,
those cases, even on those cases now, there is apps that you can run
right.
independently if you are on one.
So
So
so there's an assumption that not only are you getting a hardware ecosystem, but you're getting a software ecosystem, and you
mhm.
have that cross compatibility and similarity of use. If you flip over to the Android side of the world, the only company that approaches that is Samsung in just size and scale and number of devices that provide hardware and software compatibility. Now, let's keep in mind though, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's pretty darn close. A Samsung laptop can interact with Samsung tablets and Samsung phones. There are applications that cross the borders. The monitors work well. The watches and the earbuds. And all. You're buying into that ecosystem of hardware and software. What the reason why I'm stressing that is because it can be confusing on the Android side because people consider mistakenly that Android is an ecosystem. And I don't agree that it's really an ecosystem because there's too much of a difference
Mhm.
between how Android's implemented, what it's implemented on, and how it's supported
I agree
as compared to
100% with
something
you.
like an Apple. And even within the big Samsung ecosystem, there are still some differences depending on device, depending on version. I mean, there's another layer in this that we don't really talk about on the Android side, the actual skin layer on One UI on Android devices that creates a different experience. But the advantage of having that is you have a greater likelihood of having these devices interact cleanly and almost seamlessly, as compared to a very heterogeneous composition of Chromebooks and Android tablets and Android phones and Windows laptops. And while you can do all that, you're going to be that ecosystem.
Mhm.
You are saying that I will provide the connecting filaments and threads to get information, functionality, and capability to balance across all of these things. And do you want to do that? The argument has always been about Apple is that you get an Apple product if you just want it to work. It's not a tinkering type of platform,
Right.
which is very true. Samsung has that underlying tinkering capability, but that takes away from their ecosystem. Do they have the best of class in any given product? In one or two, I would say yes. In others, no, probably not. I mean, they're in the top five almost across the board, but there are ones where they're definitely not the best. The difference on the Apple side is there is no competition. There's no one pressing them to say, build a better Apple device
Mhm.
because you can't. Used to be, but you can't. On Android and on Windows and things like that, you still have that competition of device capability where you can go and you can find something closer to what you want. I've always made the argument that Apple really missed out on the opportunity to allow people to build their own machines and push their stuff to the outer edge and the outer edge of capability. But saying that, their ecosystem was designed that if you're going to trust the system, then you're going to trust how they're building the products. And if you do that, stuff will work
Right.
and you're not going to have a problem. If you're going to tinker and you're going to have that option to kind of get under the hood, then yeah, you're going to have situations where things don't work. So going back to that conversation of, does this work? How, what do you recommend on this side and what do you recommend on that side? From a device standpoint, on the Android side, choosing an ecosystem, and don't get me wrong, there are ecosystems aside from Samsung. You can get Lenovo devices, you can, go down HP devices and things like that. There are other options. Just be aware that they're not as tightly integrated as you're going to see from either a Samsung or an Apple type of
Mhm.
ecosystem.
So, so let me ask you a question, and this is lack of knowledge. When, because Samsung, I agree with you, the last 2 years for sure, it's been pushing very hard towards that ecosystem, but it was not always like that, or it was
No,
always like that. No.
no, not at all. Samsung's been around a long time. I mean, and
Agreed,
they
agreed. Yeah.
are, I mean, here's a little trivia piece. 15% of Korea's gross national product, I believe, comes from Samsung. That's how big this company is. And they make
Right.
everything from washers and
Mhm.
dryers to, I think, even airplanes, uh, or airplane components. There was a long time where they just would churn out products. When they would do a release, say, of phones, they would release 10 different models of phones. They knew they would sell phones, and they figured the more they put out there, the more they would sell because they would have more options. You're starting to see that whittled down
Okay.
and targeted more around specific key areas, trying to be more innovative, trying to be more distinctive. But there is also that sense of, I'm getting a Samsung product, which is starting to really carry a brand gravitas. I would say is starting to approach that of an Apple. And you see that when you talk to people who are looking to make that transition from one ecosystem to another. And that's one of the hangups is once you get into an ecosystem, getting out is really hard because of the amount of investment you put into it, especially when you cross between the big two, because now you're crossing cloud-based systems and everything else. But when you look at that structure, the more they can get you locked into an ecosystem, the greater the likelihood you will buy their secondary and ancillary products. But that transition piece, Samsung has really kind of wrapped themselves around it. The other players on this side of the space have never really gotten into it, and I'm not entirely sure why. The perfect example of someone who could have, should have, and has not is Google.
Mhm.
Google could have taken this. Now, they came close. The one thing that Google doesn't do is Windows-based machines.
Right.
That's a linchpin part of this equation. The only thing they can compete on is Chromebooks.
Mhm.
Well, okay, Samsung releases a Chromebook. They're now a direct competitor with that. They have tons of Chromebooks. Google's not going to turn around and release a Windows machine.
No.
So it's a hole in the ecosystem.
But even
When you,
but even with that, they could have make a solid ecosystem of Pixels devices, okay, where you get your Pixel phone, your Pixel tablet, your Pixel laptop, even if it's a Chromebook, and make it a powerful. The problem with the Chromebooks, and the problem is people think, oh well, Chromebooks are not great machines. No, no, Chromebooks are amazing machines. The problem is most people have experienced the cheap version of. If you get right now and you go to Samsung, okay, and bought the cheapest of the cheapest of the cheapest phone they produce, sorry, that
Yeah.
is not going to give you the same experience than the flagship. It's by definition. And that is one of the issues when you look into that ecosystem of Google on the Chromebooks. They did not release or keep them alive long enough high end devices where I'm going to be able to compare my MacBook with this device. So no, if I you give me my MacBook in metal with a very nice keyboard and you give me my kid's Chromebook from school, yeah, I don't want to work into that machine for 10 minutes. Okay, not even my kids want to work into that machine in the long term. Why? Because it looks cheap, it feels cheap, so then you get the association that the experience is going to be the same. But it's not because Chromebook is not capable, it's because it's been, on that sense, poorly marketed as an ecosystem.
Chromebooks are an odd beast because again, when you look at a Chromebook, you're looking at it from the software ecosystem because there's so many hardware options. Uh,
Mhm.
and if you look at hardware ecosystems, they have to have that cross functionality for it to deliver value. Well, either that or something stylistically differential. Uh, the Pixel Slate had that opportunity.
Mhm.
They had a very nice product there, but it was also
Right.
very high end. It didn't have the sales. And Google has never looked at their products as being sales differentiators.
Right.
They have always looked at their products as test beds, for lack of a better term.
Mhm.
This is
I
what's
agree.
advancing the software component. They wanted to show what the best and the brightest could be with their software on a particular set of hardware. Uh, So it becomes that struggle. And I think when you look at an ecosystem, if you're going to either buy into a particular manufacturer's ecosystem on the Android side, or if you're going to buy into the Apple side, the first step to take is determine what points of that ecosystem do you need to participate in, and then what are the parts that you want to participate in. So if I take, for example, starting at the top level, which would be the big heavy duty machine that you're going to do your real work on, that's likely to be either a MacBook or it's going to be a Windows laptop. That's kind of where the two fall. You can make arguments for different options, but I'd say, but that's the lion's share. The next step down is a device that's not as big as a laptop, not as powerful as a laptop, but it's more portable and it's more consumption friendly, but still can be productive. That's your tablet space. And on Apple, that's easy. iPad. I mean, it's like iPod. I mean, it's the Kleenex thing. It's a
Right.
tablet.
Mhm.
On the Android side, that's harder because we've struggled for the longest time getting good tablets on the Android side. Samsung has some really good ones. They finally started to get their hardware into shape, and the operating system is starting to creep into that space. Um, so you now have equity in that kind of realm. The next step down, that's your phones, and phones are easy enough. It's an iPhone if you're here in the U.S. or if you're anyplace else. You're probably going to go Android, which means you'll probably go Samsung phone. You might go Oppo, you might go, somebody else. Doesn't really matter. You have that layer of your ecosystem structured. Now comes all the ancillary stuff. Do you want earbuds that work with your system? Do you want monitors? Do you want keyboards? Do you want cases? Do you want this and that? And that's where, smartwatches. Do you want a smartwatch? That's when you start to look at that ecosystem and say, okay, if I'm going to start investing in this, one, does it give me the capabilities I need across the entire spectrum? Or how quickly do I have to leave that ecosystem to get extra functionality? And two, and this is probably the more important, what is the likelihood of the longevity of that ecosystem? Apple's not going anywhere. Apple products are going to be around for a long, long time. You buy Apple, you'll be able to buy Apple. Samsung's not going anywhere. Samsung's going to make products for a long, long time. You want to buy Samsung, you're going to be able to buy Samsung. If you start to look at some of the other ecosystems on the Android side, though, you have to say, are they going to be around? Am I
Mhm.
going to buy into the Motorola ecosystem? Well, maybe, but how much of a factor are they going to be? Am I going to buy into the Google system? Well, that's great, but Google loves to kill products. So what's my support level? So that's when you have to start looking at your ecosystem and decide, okay, is this going to work? And the third ecosystem that we don't talk about is the one I've talked about briefly, and that's the one we build ourselves. That's the one we do the care and feeding of ourselves to say, okay, I'm going to buy this product and this product and this product. And to get these particular features like earbuds that work on all of them, I need to buy these types of earbuds. The upside, well, the world is your oyster. You can choose whatever you want. The downside, it's up to you to make them work. You
Correct.
can't say that I'm going to buy the best AirPods out there and expect them to work great with my Samsung tablet. They'll work, but probably to only about 80% of their functionality. And that's where we have to take that into consideration. So, is there a downside? Would I tell somebody you can never go wrong buying the Samsung ecosystem? Absolutely not. You can make some pretty bad decisions. You can choose part to participate in an ecosystem that will not work for your productive needs
Correct.
just as easily as you can choose an ecosystem that should work great.
And that, as I was as we were discussing, I was listening. It then made me think, it is interesting because I agree. We have the Apple ecosystem, the Samsung ecosystem. Then we can argue the Google ecosystem, okay? Because at the end of the day, the devices exist. But then it is very interesting to see how many, the Lenovo's of the world, the HPs, the Dells, do not leave or do not have yet embrace those ecosystems, because it's not that they don't have the devices to build it, it's they have not come to create an ecosystem. So are these brands, is the ecosystem right now, the conception of the ecosystem right now as personal use, or, and that's the reason these brands that tend to focus more on the corporate than the personal are not interested there, or it's mixed and it's going everywhere.
It's an interesting challenge because the two main ecosystems that we're talking about happen to be the ones that are strongest in the consumer space, not
Mhm.
just in the professional and the business space.
Correct.
Entities like HPs and Lenovo's, those are very strong in the business space and somewhat in the consumer space, but not massively heavy. So there isn't a huge benefit to them to providing a large consumer ecosystem, that largely diverse thing. And honestly, consumer-based ecosystems are the ones that typically individual professionals will fall into. You may go and you may buy HP hardware, you may go and you may buy, Lenovo hardware for your solopreneur business or your small business, and that's great. But when it comes down to what phone am I going to get? Well, you're probably going to get an Apple or Samsung, something along that line. So you have to decide, does it make sense in those cases? And I don't think for those major manufacturers, they have the breadth of offering to offer a complete ecosystem. They
Mhm.
may offer connectivity between their devices, which they really should. They should have that streamlined connectivity. And that a lot of times they can do at a software level more so than a hardware level. But I still don't think you're going to see that as part of the equation. And I was just doing a little mental experiment. If you think about outfitting an office, I was trying to decide, could I 100% outfit an office using only Samsung products? And where I stopped was, okay, printer. Could I get a printer? And yeah, Samsung makes printers. So I could get a Samsung printer and connect it in as well. So yes, could I do 100% Samsung Office? Sure. Could I do a 100% Apple office?
No, you cannot do
No.
printers and stuff.
Used to be able to. Apple
Yeah.
used to sell printers. I remember servicing those lovely little dot matrix things. Um, but there's no, to them, there's no value in offering that particular product. Printer doesn't help them
But
any.
okay, I agree. I agree on that. But I want to go one step backwards in the sense that the ecosystem, as you said, used to belong to really Apple, okay, and that
Mhm.
was it, okay. It's been the last 2 years, maybe three, but I can guarantee two, three, I don't know, that
Oh, yeah.
Samsung has come to play into. We are building an ecosystem too, and what we know on both is when these changes on the corporate world happen, when the executives start enjoying these ecosystems and then go home or go to the office and they get something else. I remember many years back when the iPhone came out, and I remember the BlackBerry people saying, huh, we are not implementing that. Well, that's until your CEO says, I want an iPhone and I don't care. And that's how iPhone got into the market. Okay. And what is interesting is I've been a Mac user all my life, but I dropped my PC for good in 2007, and at that time there was few Macs in the business environment. You get to meetings, and
Mhm.
few people have Macs.
Yeah.
Now, between the iPhone and the iPads, more executive, high level executive, I will say, has been getting no. Don't give me a PC, give me a Mac. Why? Because the ecosystem, and they have forced their IT in business to push these machines. So is this a tendency that we will see going down, or no, forget about it because the cost will be prohibitive from the perspective of the IT budget?
I don't, I don't think so, because one of the core shifts that happened with IT is the idea of implementing bring your own device.
Mhm.
When IT departments started to accept external devices into their closed environment, that opened the floodgates for this. That introduced a ton of Apple devices, a ton of Samsung devices, because at the corporate level, Apple has this little tiny smidge of representation. And typically, it's only if you're within the graphic arts department.
Mhm.
If you work in marketing, you may have one of those. Otherwise, you're probably going to have an HP or a Dell or something like that sitting, or a Lenovo, sitting on your desk, because those ecosystems were designed for IT support. Things like a
Right.
Samsung system and an Apple system and all, while they can be supported by IT, weren't set up the same way, didn't have the same principle. With bring your own device, now it's fair game. If you can follow the rules of the IT department, you can use whatever you've got. One of the things that actually does that really well, Chromebooks. Chromebooks introduced the opportunity to have devices in an environment that could connect to cloud-based services, which I think is the other part of this that we haven't really talked about yet. But they could connect to cloud-based services, and if there was an issue, you could power wash a Chromebook and it's back to the beginning, and then it just uses the cloud-based services again.
Right.
And I think cloud-based services is the other key linchpin for the adoption of an ecosystem, because often, and even less on Apple, more on the Android side, it's the cloud-based services that provide the bridge and the connectivity between the devices. If you need to move files from your tablet to your phone to your Windows laptop, you're going through the cloud. You're not going to use the equivalent, of an AirDrop or something like that, because for the most part, it doesn't exist.
Right.
But the cloud does, and you can pass stuff through that way. You can access it. You can store there. So all of these become branches off of that central tree, rather than a mesh network of devices. And I think that's one of the things when you look at an ecosystem, you have to look at what's going to be the center of your ecosystem.
Right.
If you want to truly do a cloud-based system, great, then you got to pick a cloud provider. You can pick somebody like a Microsoft or a Google or something like that, or a Dropbox, where your information is going to be stored. Now the only requirement you have is that every device you choose be able to interoperate with that. Now you can build your own ecosystem. You're still not going to have those fringe capabilities. You're not going to go grab some third party, smartwatch and expect total compatibility within your system. But you can get close. You can get back to that 80% that we were talking about earlier. But I think that's that third group. When you pick a cloud provider, when you pick a point that's going to act as the hub of your spokes on your wheel of productivity, there's a t-shirt. Um, that's that decision can make all the difference for you. And again, unfortunately it's not an easy decision either, because do I go Google? Do I go Microsoft? That's probably
Right.
the most common debate there. The majority of the people will go Google. Majority of business will go Microsoft. Depends on the size of your business. Depends what you want to do. And
Well,
odds are a lot of times you have both.
and that is a very interesting point. As we start talking about ecosystems, and honestly, I initially thought on the hardware side, but not on the software side, and that's a very, very good point. Taking Apple out of that software ecosystem, because I don't think any company seriously can live in iCloud. Sadly, it's not robust enough. You may need to be a very small business. You will need to go Google or Microsoft. But I know people who that's their ecosystem. So they can grab any device, PC,
Yeah.
Mac, Linux, because it's not about the hardware, the software on the hardware. It's about, as you said, the cloud. So they live and everything works in their Google environment. So they just need Chrome into that machine so they can access everything in their world. So that's at the
It's
end of the
funny
day, it's another ecosystem.
to go back to like the gray hair in my beard and think back in the day. You had If you go back to the old terminal based systems and the mainframe based systems and the client server based systems, which were the predecessors to all of this,
Mhm.
it didn't matter what the endpoints were. What mattered was the center and the storage and the
Right.
information access. Well, that's very similar to what we have again. As long as you have something that works very well for that cloud based access, there are fewer and fewer things where you have to have applications that work on a local machine. And apps are a little different because they give you extra functionality that you can't emulate out in the cloud yet. They're coming, but yet. But even that's becoming smaller and smaller. So now when you start to say, okay, I'm choosing the Google cloud ecosystem, what are the best devices for interacting with that cloud? And that's going to help define my ecosystem and its level of success. Granted, I can choose all kinds of stuff, but certain things work better than other things. If I'm going to go Microsoft Cloud, well, honestly, Microsoft Windows is going to work better with Microsoft Cloud. Microsoft Office is going to work better with Microsoft Cloud. And it kind of makes
Mhm.
sense. That's what they want you to do. So you're buying into that ecosystem. So now your decision making is structured around what's going to elevate that whole ecosystem for me even more. So it's a very stressful decision for people. People are always afraid of making the wrong choice. You know, ooh, should I pick Apple? Ooh, should I pick Samsung? Ooh, should I pick Windows? Should I go Chromebook? The odds are pretty good. Whatever ecosystem you join into, at some point you will leave it and move to another ecosystem. I used to have an iPhone for a long time. I had an iPhone up to iPhone 4, I think I had. Used to use it all the time. And then I made the switch. That switch was tough for that time period. It was difficult to switch everything over. You had to move things out of the cloud. You had to move music around. You had to all kinds of stuff. That has to be a planned execution. The longer you're in an ecosystem, the harder it is to get out.
That's correct.
It's like moving your house. The longer you're in a house, the harder it is to move out of it because you have so much stuff accumulated. And you have to decide, do I want portability, or do I have enough confidence in the decision of the ecosystem that I've joined to stay with it? And here's the one part we hadn't talked about, and deal with its faults and its foibles. Deal
Mhm.
with its issues. Accept them as part of the price of being in that ecosystem. And yeah, you kind of have to if you're gonna jump in. I have a Samsung Note 20 Ultra phone. Love my phone. And I could have upgraded a couple times by now, but I haven't upgraded it yet. One of the downsides, there are very few accessories that are dedicated for that phone. Why? Because not a huge number of other people have that. So there isn't a benefit for it. If you want something that has a broad ecosystem, wide when it comes to accessories and extensions, you need to choose the most popular components of that core ecosystem to be yours. So for example, for an iPhone, you get the iPhone, what is it now? 14, 15, I forget which number it is.
14.
14. Okay, so you get the iPhone 14. You're going to have the greatest likelihood of getting accessories and stuff for that one. If you get an iPhone 14, what is it? The Pro or the Max?
Pro
I don't know the
Max. That's the
Pro
biggest
Max.
one.
Oh, okay. I was right on both. So if you get that, that's a little different. Physically, it's a slightly different design. You're going to have a smaller pool of accessories to draw on. So you have to say, at where's my give and take? And what is the value and what is the draw in? And I think that's probably the biggest issue, is that third party accessory market can really determine how deep you have to get into that core ecosystem. Something like, if I get a Samsung S23 phone, just the regular S23, lots of stuff out there. Lots of accessories out there for that particular device because it is their common denominator phone.
Right.
Latest and greatest, targeted for the broadest market. Therefore, I'll have the broadest footprint. I may not have the best capabilities in that particular device, though. The Plus and the Ultra are much better, much more powerful. But I'm climbing to the top of that pyramid. And at the top of that pyramid, you're dealing with rarefied air when it comes to some of the breadth of your capabilities. So again, that all fits into where your decision is on your entries and exits with a particular ecosystem. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about, and let's hit this now as we start to bring this around. What if you have a truly cross-platform ecosystem? You're deciding that I'm going to have an Apple phone and an iPad and a Samsung laptop and a Chromebook. And if you're looking at that kind of a mix, I think you wind up going back to the third one that we talked about earlier, which is the core connection you have then between all of those is the cloud piece. That's your
Right.
interconnection, because without that, those devices don't interact, or they do very, very weakly. But at that point, you say, what's the cloud piece that will allow me to connect all of these best in class, for lack of a better term, devices for me into a working, cohesive ecosystem for myself? Make that decision, and then that becomes your deciding factor on everything.
Well, so let me ask you this. And you mentioned, you moved from the Apple ecosystem to the Android ecosystem. And like you, like me, your ecosystem mostly consists on your main ecosystem, at least consists on Samsung devices. Mine consists on Apple devices. What will require for you to change ecosystems? One. And two, will you move out of the ecosystem? Not necessarily this ecosystem. That's two different questions. So, will you, now that you have experienced the ecosystem, will you go back to not having ecosystem? Okay. Or, second question is, what will require for you to move out of the ecosystem?
That's a really tough one. I have gone if we think about ecosystems less as bubbles and
Mhm.
more as a spectrum, with Apple being at one far end, and just for sake of argument, we'll say Samsung at the other far end. uh, it's a transition along that line between the two. If I were to look at it that way, I could conceivably say that yes, I may introduce or may need to at some point introduce Apple product into my ecosystem. Those to me would be more accessories than true core components of that ecosystem. Why? Because I know I've defined how I work around a lot of the capabilities in the tools that I use. Now, if we take the third one that we talked about, which is the cloud-based ecosystem, and we park that right in the middle, then we're talking about a different conversation, because it is conceivable that enough things happen in the cloud-based ecosystem to elevate it to the point where it actually draws from the other two ends, where you stop getting stuff in the one ecosystem that you already exist because it's not best of class, because you need to work with that center point. And that's, I get this mental image of every time you see the demonstration of a black hole or a body in space on the stretched grid canvas, and you put this heavy object in and it kind of tapers down to it, how space curves down to it. That's kind of what I'm picturing these ecosystems are. The weight of the ecosystems determine your draw to them. Well, if that center gets heavier, if we start to see massive improvements or accelerations within that center ecosystem, let's say, for example, they're compelled by AI, is pushing that to a new level, then yeah, it is conceivable that I would leave a dedicated ecosystem and start to move to devices that are more friendly and more capable with that center point, if that center point is becoming a more powerful available set of capabilities. I don't see
Right.
that happening anytime soon, but it is possible.
Yeah.
How about you? What would it take for you to move away from Apple?
Because of what I do, I play with the other platforms, and I even decide to upgrade my my Kindle. Okay, I wanted something that could do a little bit more than the Kindle that I had. So I got a Boox, a Boox. It's an Android device, and my idea was to really replace the Kindle. It's a paper ink device, runs on Android, so I could install some applications if I wanted to. And my initial idea was, be able to read RSS papers, Kindle application, and all that. And it's a nice device. Do I use it enough? Honestly, not. I had a Chromebook that I used for teaching. It's a nice Chromebook, yes, and but I think in order for me to move, will require the ecosystem. So today, if I will need to move out of Apple, my only option because of that most likely will be moving to a Samsung, so I can have a full ecosystem and be able to change. I change devices for there are things that I like to do on a device or other, and I like that flexibility, and I do not want to lose it. So, um, can I go to a Google, digital ecosystem and then put any hardware? Maybe, but I like the ability to have the same applications, and that doesn't work. So I have never played with to leave, but I have play to see where I can extend my
Mhm.
possibilities. And as of today, there is nothing that I will leave.
Yeah, and I think that's really the key that anyone should take away from our conversation today is there is no superior ecosystem.
Mhm.
There is the ecosystem that works for you, and you should be willing to let that ecosystem evolve.
Right.
Where people get into problems is when they become myopic around an ecosystem. The ones that, I will only buy Apple, I will only
Right.
buy Samsung, I will only buy, then you're limiting yourself. You're limiting the possibilities of what you have available to you and the improvements of it. And that to me just seems, you know, nearsighted and foolish.
And not only that, I software evolves and change, and you need to know what's happening in the other platforms, especially on your favorite or more common use tools that you use for operations. Because what happened if the company disappear? And I understand in theory that doesn't happen, but the reality is it does. Okay, software gets bought by company X, and company X decide to cut it, so they put their version. What was the one that Microsoft bought? Wunderlist was an a task disk was
Yeah, they
Wunderlist.
turned it into to do.
But they turned it into a light version of stamp
Oh,
the
it's not the same
Microsoft
product.
thing. Oh, it's the same product?
No, it's not the same product at
It's
all.
not. That's what I
It has
that's what I
some of
mean.
the base features and the developer switched over, but it's a different product entirely. And that
Correct.
happens all the time.
All the time. So if that happened, okay, if Apple tomorrow decide to change everything, okay, what are you going to do with those core applications? Or you know that if there is or not is an equivalent. And that's one of the reasons for me to play with all these other platforms. I get it. I enjoy it too. I'm not going to say otherwise, but it is important to know where are, for me it's work. Okay. Because when a client come and said, hey, I there is a new update for my Microsoft OneNote. Should I upgrade? Yes or no? Well, I need to be able to ask what are the features that you use, And as we
And
begin the
that's
story on this podcast, this person wanted to have a digital notebook. Well, what are the kind of things you are wanting to do? Okay, because there is difference, okay, into what you can do in one ecosystem versus the other. There is a very significant difference between applications. For me as a writer, I love an application called Scrivener, and I don't want to lose Scrivener. And as much as I have tried to use more Chromebooks and Android devices, Scrivener is one of there are two OneNote. Sorry, they one day that is my journal application. Okay, there is a software that is called Mariner that I use for short articles and Scrivener, and those three things are the first three apps that are on my app. Email, all that I can replace easily. Those three a little bit more challenging for me. So that for me is a limitation for the easy transition. In general, I like to cast the net as wide as possible. So that's the reason my office has Android devices and Windows devices, because I want to make sure, hey, if my Apple ecosystem died today, can I go into these other machines and be productive?
yeah, it's an important differentiation to make in your system. If you had to change, how disruptive would it be? It's
Mhm.
going to be disruptive. It's going to be highly
No
disruptive.
question.
However, would it be
Catastrophic
disabilitating?
disruptive.
Yes, catastrophic is probably the better term. Are you going to be able to move forward with what you do? And honestly, that's one of the strengths of the cloud-based center of so many of these ecosystems. Even if it's not a core part, it should be integrated into your system because that's what allows the transition
Mhm.
easily. I mean, I look at again, they're all Samsung devices I have. but my cloud part is Microsoft primarily. And it's been good. This has been an added bonus when you look at steps that Samsung has taken with tighter interactions and partnerships with Microsoft on their products. That's just a benefit to me. That reinforces that behavior. So buying into an ecosystem, yeah, it's got as many ups as it does downs. It's a big choice. It can be an extremely big expense over time, but it also can be a big savings over time when it comes to interoperability and actual functionality and getting things done. So this is the kind of thing I would love to hear from people on. I'd love to hear their opinions one way or the other, or maybe there's an ecosystem that they're in that we've
And
kind
we
of
haven't
glossed
considered.
over. Yeah, I'd love to hear about it because I'd love to
Cool.
compare. I I kind of think it's a shame that there are only really two major players in this equation. I would love to. The rest are on the fringes of the field. Uh, I'd like to see somebody else. I wish Google would step up and do it, but I don't see them doing it. And honestly, they have such a propensity to killing products that I would have a hard time completely being all in on it.
And that is
And
my risk with Google is that is okay, fine. Even you mentioned the Pixel Slate, and that machine was on a list to acquire, so I could play with. But given was not a priority, it's not a priority. It's not a machine that will get priority on my system, so it was there. Okay, for me to have a big block of time so I could play with it, and they kill it before I got there, and that was a
yeah,
machine that was so I end up getting Lenovo Duet 5, I think it is, with 13 inches instead of the Slate, exactly for that reason.
well, and that's one of the things that, and just to kind of bring this around to an end, one of the things we didn't really talk about is longevity. And you may decide to be in a system that ecosystem that you know the devices are going to be around for a long time. Apple's a good example of that. Apple does have a tendency to carry their devices forward for a long period of time. You'll have a MacBook that's, a 2015, 2016 MacBook that you can still use and still run with. Uh,
It's
Windows
8 to 10 years.
machines,
8 to 10
yeah, Windows
years.
machines not as much. They're getting better, but not as much as they used to. Chromebooks are a good example of that. I have a Samsung Chromebook that when I look at it now, I've gotten easily 8 years out of it.
Mhm.
But I'm also at the end of that 8 years. I have another Chromebook here that I've got. This is good till 2028 on updates. So investing in something like this, it's up to the hardware to fail because I know from a software standpoint, it's going to keep working. And that may be the key deciding factor is, can I get something that I can just keep, that it's going to keep working? Phones have that challenge. Used to be phones you needed to upgrade, you upgraded pretty quickly, every year, every 2 years. Now it's actually getting out to about a 3-year window, which I think is more realistic. But
Yeah.
that's not because the phones aren't as powerful. That's not because they're not doing the job. It's because the software isn't being updated. When they stop updating the security software on your phone, it's time to upgrade your phone because that becomes a risk. It has nothing to do with the hardware obsolescence. And that's a key part of your ecosystem. How long will the manufacturers of those devices support those devices?
Mhm.
You may get the coolest thing out there, but if they're only going to support it for a year, I don't know that that's an ecosystem that you want to really
That
be
you want to
involved
buy
in.
into. Mhm.
So,
Well, with this, follow us where you like to listen to podcasts, like us, or subscribe to us and leave us a review. You can also interact with us in personalproductivity.club. We have a channel there for cross platform. So we are Gus Tupinat and Argel Wicks. See you next time from your favorite device. Thank you.